Well, I'm going to go ahead and make a start. I want to welcome everyone to the first Consumer Health Panel at this year's RESI Conference, and the first ever focus on consumer health at RESI conferences in the past. And we're delighted to be here. My name is Stacy Feld, and I'm part of the team at Johnson & Johnson Innovation. And we are delighted to be one of the sponsors of RESI, as the mission on focusing on investment in early stage innovation is very well aligned with our mission of supporting entrepreneurship and accelerating innovation in the life sciences, medical device, and consumer health sectors. I'm going to ask each of them, starting with Garheng Kong from HealthQuest, to just give a quick introduction, background on the investment scope. And because we may all have different ideas of what consumer health means to us, some might think it's synonymous with digital health, some might think it's wearable technologies. If each of you could give, from your perspective, what what consumer health means to you, that would be really helpful for us having a discussion, and I think for the entrepreneurs and companies in the audience.
So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. So just briefly by way of background, so HealthQuest, the name's a little obvious. We focus on healthcare, but our definition of healthcare is really around optimizing value in healthcare. And so sometimes it's very high-end science, and to be fair, sometimes it's not very high-end science, but it's used frequently in managing somebody's health, and so that has a large impact on the overall healthcare ecosystem. So we invest across a wide range of healthcare subsectors, if you will, certainly devices and diagnostics and healthcare IT, as well as consumer medical products. For us, the common theme is whether or not ultimately, either as a function of patient outcome or healthcare economics or both, it's valuable to the healthcare system. So that's the way we think about it. Everything that we invest in is sort of early commercial, if you will. Sometimes it could be $1 in revenue. Some of our companies have a few million in revenue or more. Most of them are not profitable, but what they are is ramping quite aggressively in terms of growth. And so they're growing 50, 100, 150% year on year. And so for us, it's a question of where does the adoption come from, whether it's the individual patient or the physician or the payer. Certainly on the consumer side, usually it's the patient. Sometimes it's physician also driven. So we tend to come from a slightly, I don't know, technical is the right word, but a slightly more medical perspective when we think about consumer health. And so the things that we think about is this sort of continuum of interventions. On the very far end, you say cancer chemotherapy, right? You need a doctor to prescribe that, you need an insurance company to pay for that, and usually the consumer is not making that decision. And then on the other end, you go buy a toothbrush, and usually the consumer is making that decision. And somewhere in between, those things collide, and people talk about, certainly a lot of the cosmetics are consumer-driven, even though they're medical in nature. And so there's this full continuum. What we have found is that patients are being more and more aggressive about managing their healthcare. So when we think about consumer health, it's really the continuum of healthcare decisions, but where the consumer is being more and more involved. So that means we're probably less likely to pursue the truly only retail opportunities. So if you think about digital health, we're interested in things that help patient outcomes, but we're not likely to do the app on the iStore that says, don't forget to exercise this morning, right? So when we think about it, there usually is some proprietary nature. It's a unique approach, and we're both involved with a company called First Aid Shot Therapy that is a consumer medical product, but it's actually a drug, and it's a different format that has pain and upset stomach and so forth. So those are the kinds of things that we would consider.
Great, thank you. Jessica?
Thanks, everyone. Great to be here as well. I'm Jessica Howe. I'm a principal at Montreux Equity Partners. We are growth capital investors in healthcare. So we represent more of a later stage view on the panel. We focus primarily on commercial stage companies doing, call it 5 to 50 million in revenue, and we like the high growth rates. So 50% or over top line growth is what we're typically looking for. In terms of healthcare, consumer health is one of our three big verticals, the others being clinical health and digital health. I admit there's a lot of blurred lines between digital health and consumer health these days, as you see, quite a bit of intersection and convergence between the two. For us, consumer, is not only, consumer health depends on the end user, but it's also driven by the purchasing decision maker, right? So if you're buying it and using it, that qualifies as consumer health. We also like consumer health in that you're actually opening up a part of the market that's 75% of the population, right? So 75% of the population is generally healthy and looking for, a lot of, it's healthy living, active lifestyle. So we'll invest in solutions that are products and services that are for the average person, that are at least, addressing health on a more broader basis. So great to be here and look forward to chatting more about our investment strategy and thesis.
Great. Tracy, your fund has a unique focus. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that.
Sure, thank you. So Astardi Ventures is a women's and children's health focused fund. We look at both consumer and clinical solutions, but really recognizing the convergence with women as the key health decision maker and the desire to be more proactive, much to what Garhan talked about in their health prevention, early intervention strategies. So we will do things both in the clinic and direct to consumer. But our one kind of fundamental premise is that there has to be good scientific data or clinical data driving the solution. So we too are less likely to do kind of apps or kind of wearables just for the sake of data. We're really looking for something that can be actionable either by the patient or the person using the device or the technology, and or by the clinician who's treating that patient. So our first investment thesis is actually going to be really around high-risk pregnancies and preterm birth. So looking at solutions there that may be either consumer or clinical facing.
Great, thank you. So maybe just to get us started and to jump in, Garhan, maybe you could start off with just giving your sense of what the funding landscape looks like. I mean, we're here during the week of JP Morgan, and there's a lot of number crunching going on with respect to healthcare and pharmaceutical and therapeutic investment dollars being deployed. What does the space look like, without getting quantitative, what's your sense of what the space looks like in this broad kind of continuum of consumer health that you outlined?
Yeah, so it's an interesting little bit of a conundrum in the sense that, or if you walk around here, probably 85% of you are talking about drugs, biotech, and so forth. But consumer health is actually something that everybody can relate to as well, and so it's, I think, generally interesting. And so what we find is that the investor landscape is everybody kind of wants to do consumer health, but the question is how many people actually are focused on doing consumer health, right? Because when you describe an opportunity to them, say, oh, that's kind of interesting, I'll consider it, but it's not squarely in the focus of what they typically do. And so finding the investors who actually want to be focused on consumer health and have it as a vertical or sort of sector-specific target area, it's actually quite small. So, I think the hard part as our companies, or as some of you may consider raising capital, is actually finding investors who really will do it, right? Everybody will take the pitch, it sounds kind of interesting, it doesn't usually require some special technical expertise. And so there is continued interest, I think will continue to grow, but finding the investor set that will actually pull the trigger on a consumer health deal is different, because when you think about a lot of the healthcare companies, they want to own the molecule, or here's the patent, which most consumer health companies don't have. And so it's a slightly different mentality. The other part that we found interesting is that the tech investors are much more aggressive there, because that's something they feel like they can get their hands on. It's not quite as heavily regulated. And so we've actually seen a different type of investor group be more active and participate as well, which is good from a resource point of view. It's less good because there are still some regulations, right? You can't actually claim everything under the sun on your product, and so you do have to be really careful there as well.
Yeah. So Jessica, maybe just a twist on the question. I mean, you're investing a little bit later in the product development or technology development cycle. where are you tracking investments in this space? What's the funding landscape look like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are a little bit later stage, so we like to see companies that have more proof points and a little bit more data. In consumer health, you're generally on the market pretty quickly. We like that. So I would say, you're past, usually you don't have to deal with regulatory reimbursement, so we like that. A lot of it's out of pocket. So there is a lot of data that we can look for, and it's usually customers, your sales. I mean, there's reference points for us. That being said, I think the tough part with consumer health is we won't invest in something that's very fatty, very trendy, and that happens a lot. Whether it's like a food trend that gets overblown or a fitness app. I mean, it's great. You can get from 0 to 10 million users, but how do you get from that 10 million you really scale?
So Tracy, question for you. I mean, you're focused on such a powerful demographic in terms of decision making and deploying healthcare dollars, and much of the business models of the companies are direct to consumer. What are the proof points that you're looking for that kind of fall under the recipe for success?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it does vary really by the solution itself. But I think one of the so we do very early stage investing, quite frankly, kind of pre-revenue. One of the things we try to do is use strong groups who know consumer products really and can kind of bridge the gap. We see our specialty being understanding the medical side, or if there is some regulatory. But we're looking for early adoptions, good user group results, or if you will, beta testing results. And really trying to align that to value propositions and see what the consistency is among different categories, usually with women, on the care and the impact the solution has had. And then I think the really tricky part is trying to decide really what's fad and what's kind of fact, because I think we feel the same way. We'd like to have something that has sustainability with this user group that can be very powerful, and they're very socially driven. They tend to refer. Women make a lot of decisions based on friends as opposed to clinicians. And so that network, if you get it wrong, could be very detrimental, but it could also be very powerful if you get it right. So those are some of the factors we look at.
So Jessica and Garheng, those are earlier signals than, in this early commercial, even later stage commercial. And so revenue is a nice indicator at the stage that you're looking at. But sometimes for companies that are focused on the consumer market, getting from 1 million to 10 million or even 20 million can be as much of a ramp as getting, launching. And so I wonder if you can both share either some anecdotes or some other signals that you look for in terms of proof points that something isn't a fad, that it kind of passes what I call the go back rule. If you forget something at home, are you turning around and parking in the driveway and going back for it, like we all would do for our phone today?
I think in terms of kind of additional proof points, or this commercial proof of concept as we call it, especially with consumer health, you want to see clear distribution channels. Either you're going direct and you're selling online and it's a big portion of business and you've demonstrated how you can do that successfully, or you've got great retail partnerships and you're in Walgreens and Rite Aid and CVS, and those are clear and demonstrate. Those are hard to get, right? So even if you have one of those, we're in a consumer aesthetics company and we just got into Sephora. That's a big retail chain for us, and that's a nice signal to show that there's potential, adoption from the greater mass, right? So that's something we look for. In terms of when we do diligence, even things like looking for 5-star product reviews. I mean, we're all in the Amazon.com, how we purchase things, right? We look for reviews. So when we do diligence, we want to see, so make sure your products have 5-star reviews, right? And 5-star ratings and great reviews. And you can do that. you can buy some of it, but or you can get your friends and family to make sure you're posting right. And then the other part is, you're probably, hopefully building a brand, right? So you may start out with what we call a hero product, right? One product that gets a lot of the attention, but you're building a brand. So you want a strong platform, and you want to show the investor that you can build a big pipeline. Take Fitbit. I was just talking to the CEO of Fitbit last night, and they started with a tracker. Now it's this large ecosystem, and they're doing 1.8 billion in revenue, right? And it's beyond just, even though they're known for this tracker, it's beyond that. So
Our booth at CES was about 4 times the size of this room.
yeah.
Is it
Fitbit?
Yeah.
Well, this market
The question was, is it a fad?
This market didn't even exist 5 years ago, right? The wearables market. I think none of us, we looked at a ton of wearables. None of us appreciated how much global interest there was in wearables and tracking. And there's so many different configurations now, right? So is it a fad? I think at this point, it's beyond a fad. You have a successful company that went public that demonstrated that it hasn't.
Actually, so I'll answer your question, but that's a good point in terms of how investors think about things. So there are some investors, actually, I don't know if you guys made an investment, but there are some investors that buy into that macro trend and say, I'm going to make these bets, right? Others are actually trying to decide on a company by company basis what's the right investment. And so, I'll share my bias, which is I wish we had invested in Fitbit. But if Fitbit had come into our door today, we still would have passed, because there's 50 Fitbits that showed up, and 49 of them went to zero, and one of them turned out, right? And so, from the consumer medicine point of view, you have to be pretty careful about it. And so even though on a macro trend, it's not a trend, it's here now, so that's definitely the case. But different investors will look at it slightly differently, and even though we'd all love to have invested in that company, if we're really honest with ourselves, at least if I'm honest with myself, we actually saw, I don't know that we saw Fitbit, but we saw probably a dozen different of these things, none of which we did, and I guess we're glad we didn't, because I have never heard of the other dozen. So that's just one.
It's a great and insignificant point.
So food for thought. The other, just one point I would add to Jessica's comment about proof points. If you can get a longitudinal distributor like a Walgreens or a Walmart or CVS, or pick whoever it is, Sephora, those are great. The other way you can win, though, is if you win on a unit per store per unit time in a certain location, right? Because what we're basically looking for is, can you cube farm out your answer, right? Like, you won here, and then top line is not significant. It's probably not big at all, but that store times 50 stores, every week you moved however many units. And we need to believe that that is somehow some press copy, and you can do it over and over
So you
again.
figured out the formula.
And so that's the other proof point. So it could be actually the absence of top line, but on a model basis, it looks attractive.
Yeah.
So.
So we've heard a range of what the proof points are from these experienced investors. And there's some first-time CEOs and entrepreneurs in the audience, and some experienced ones as I look across the room. And I think it's always helpful to hear, what are some pitfalls, what are some, common mistakes that are made along the fundraising process in positioning your company, particularly given your point, Garheng, about you might be a consumer company, but when you walk into, Sequoia, you're a technology company, and how you kind of shape that story. So Tracy, maybe starting with you, if you could share some common mistakes, common pitfalls along the way.
Yeah, and I'm not sure these are going to be earth-shattering, but I do think they're more consistent than I would hope. Good advisors, so if you have a direct-to-consumer product, really having people advising you if they're not on your team because you don't have the budget, who've really put products into these channels and really can understand and help you appreciate the challenges of not just getting that first sale, but getting, repeated sales and partners and distributors. And then where there's a clinical bent, and in a lot of cases what we look at is, tell me that this matters in a clinical setting or to providers. Strong advisors who actually aren't just big names on paper, so people who actually have called by us can talk about your product in relation to other things, and they're not just a big name who's on everybody's advisory board in your space. So I think, being selective in who is help guiding you early on is really important. And again, we're more pre-revenue stage, so we look at kind of advisory and the technology development and the early proof points. But it's quality over quantity, quite frankly. And so we use those advisors to help triangulate our network on where you really sit and how you're differentiated. And I think selecting those people could be really important too.
Jessica,
Yeah.
anecdotes that you could share,
Yeah,
areas to avoid.
Yeah, I'd say that, especially with a consumer company or any consumer product, really getting your social media strategy right. And it's a struggle that some of our companies have faced is they didn't necessarily get it right in the first place, and now they're kind of struggling with what is that, do you hire that talent internally? Do you hire an agency? And it's so important, right? You're trying to sell direct to consumer, so and that's a big part of selling these days is make sure you understand where you can access your audience, right? Honest Company got their start blogging to mommies, right? Now it's a lot bigger, but understanding what works in beauty. YouTube is a really important channel because women want to see how you apply makeup. So understanding your product, your appropriate marketing strategy, and essentially more importantly your social media strategy. I think we see companies get this wrong all the time.
So the other thing, and this is not surprising, but I do think it's actually really important to be realistic. And so when you think about your projections and your timelines, there exists a company that probably did the hockey stick thing before, but if you look at your sort of sector, or maybe you're creating a sector, if you really look at how long it's going to take and how much time and capital it's going to take, I do think that that's an important distinction, because in healthcare you have the whole regulatory piece, and so people feel like there's rules, and so they accept a certain timeline. In consumer medicine and consumer healthcare products, there isn't necessarily those gating items, and so for some reason all of a sudden it's going to go faster, and it happens, but most of the time it does take a little bit more capital, it does take a little bit more time, and I think what happens is, especially on the investor side, sometimes people think, well, we don't have to do a phase 3 trial, there's no FDA, it'll be a lot cheaper, it'll be a lot faster, and then you're not actually capitalized correctly when you find out that you're actually building a brand. So yeah, you don't have to get FDA approval, but people actually have to have heard of you. And that turns out to be actually pretty expensive, because the phase 2 trial is like nothing compared to like rolling out ads across all the TV stations and buying a Super Bowl time or something like that. So you just want to be thoughtful about the grass is actually not ever greener, it's just a different kind of grass, and so you just have to be thoughtful about that.
So for Jessica and Darhang again, you've both articulated relatively broad investment scope, and I wonder if you can reflect on or maybe predict some of the things specifically that you're interested in for this year and possibly beyond. I mean, we talked about Fitbit, and we've talked about consumer products companies. What are some of the non-faddish areas that you're interested in? And if you don't think in that way, maybe say why and what drives kind of the next deal that you're going to do.
So, I mean, we do think in that way, in the sense that we would like to think that we can predict some trends, and we spend a lot of time in healthcare, and so hopefully we see some of that. I mean, the truth is most of the deals that we do are because some entrepreneur has actually been thinking about it a lot more than we have, and has an insight that they made which resonates with us, as opposed to wow, I have this great idea, I hope somebody can do it. And so, but that aside, what are some of the trends that we would be interested in? I mean, so there's one trend in particular that I'm fond of, which is this concept of doing medicine at home. Right, so we've already talked a lot about medicine in the hospital and moving that to the doctor's office because that's better, right? And now you don't have to, if you get a scope, you can actually do that in the 23-hour ambulatory surgery. You don't have to get, admitted, for example. So the question is, what kind of medicine can you do that is currently in the hospital or in the doctor's office, and can you do it at home, right? And there's lots of home diagnostic tests, right? The home pregnancy test, which completely changed the way we manage women's health, because now you can do it at home. You don't need a doctor to go draw you blood and tell you whether or not you're pregnant. So this concept of how much of it can we do at home, I mean, safely and efficaciously and so forth, but I do think there will be a lot more medicine that's done that way, and not just because consumers want to do it, one, of course, you get a better answer, you do it yourself. It's way more cost effective for the healthcare system for you to do it yourself than for you to schedule an appointment with a doctor and deal with all of that. And so, when we think about trends, we're hoping to find, I would say, similarly good outcomes or interventions, but that can be done by the consumer at home.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. We're looking at a lot of home health solutions as well. Another area that we as a firm have been very interested in is in the senior care market. I mean, and the trends and growth rates support this, right? So there's going to be approaching 50 million people 65 and up over the next few years. That's a big number. And people are becoming more tech savvy and also taking, control, more empowered to take control of their health. And I think that senior market is craving new solutions. So I don't know what that's going to be in terms of an actual consumer product or service, but there's something there that I think we'll make investment in.
So Tracy, to take that to the other end of the age spectrum for pediatrics and children, there's certainly, I saw my share last week of sensors on the feet, the bellies, onesies of babies. What's your perspective on technology being brought into this space, and what's on your horizon for children and women's health?
Yeah, I think there's, I want to be very careful so I don't offend anyone. There's a lot of monitoring type wearables or kind of crib-based solutions. And I think from our perspective, and we look at things sort of more clinical or actionable, you can create a lot of angst with a lot of data, with especially with first-time moms, but with moms in general. And so we're kind of looking more at things that might care for a particular patient population. So if you have a child who has high risk of a condition or has a respiratory concern, that's a little bit different for us than just my baby's a healthy full-term baby and I just need to know on my smartphone 24/7 how it's breathing. That's not as interesting to us. But I do think care in the home and empowering parents, particularly moms, but parents to care for their children in a more proactive way and be more informed. So monitoring whether or not your child who has asthma who's at school is compliant or helping situations where you're reliant on other caregivers in your absence, but that data is again very actionable or tied to a condition. That's kind of more where we see the space going, and kind of just improving the health and the compliance of children, because again, it's a growing population, whether it's obesity or allergies or anything. Low-cost data that patients or parents can use to help manage it and give peace of mind, we think people are willing to pay for, and can help with outcomes and reducing ER visits and things like that.
So maybe just to address what is probably something that we are all feeling. It's a difficult environment on the early stage investing side, and I wonder if you could all share just your thoughts on alternative funding strategies for entrepreneurs that are looking to, take the first lap with their companies and the traditional venture market is not available to them. Jessica, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Again, we're a little bit more later stage, but I think there are a lot of sources for earlier stage seed or Series A capital out there through alternatives. So there's angel networks that are pretty active. Accelerators, we're sponsors of Rock Health, and we're actually investors in their fund as well. And they incubate companies. I think it's a dozen companies every year. Stacy can talk about J&J Labs and what she does there. Nonprofits like the Gates Foundation, they're looking for partnerships and solutions too.
Tracy, any thoughts on alternative early stage funding strategies?
Yeah, no, I agree with Jessica. I think crowdfunding too gives you a sense of market response, so it's a dual purpose exercise to run through as well. There are some companies we see though that just, especially if we deal with pregnancy, if your product's not going to be ready in 6 months, you can't really effectively address delivering a product to that market in the time frames. But I think family offices are another group that we're seeing quite active. And these are very hard networks to find. I don't want to make it sound trivial at all. But asking around in some of the less likely places, but they tend to be very patient. They tend to have a personal connection or can relate. And I think consumer health does benefit from the fact that it is relatable to groups. It's not as difficult as if you're a molecule or something with a heavier scientific bent. So I think that group's important as well.
Yeah. One last question before we do open it up to you and your questions. Maybe to take the focus a bit beyond just simply capital, which we realize is a significant part of all of your strategies. If we roll the tape forward, you've made an investment. What are some of the things that you add in your portfolio management and in your board roles that really distinguishes you and that delivers value beyond just capital in your portfolio companies? Maybe you could all share an anecdote.
Yeah, sure. I think, again, we're looking for companies that are a little bit more mature. Where we can be really helpful is with strategic relationships. As you're kind of thinking down the line, how you're going to exit, banking relationships. I mean, we took 3 companies public last year. We can add a little bit of. I mean, you're probably you're thinking about growing your business, right? You're not thinking about who's going to buy you or how to. And we've done this multiple times, so we can help you navigate that.
I think at the end of the day, right, our job as investors is to be really good sounding boards for the management team, right? Whether it be building your company, no matter how smart you are, if somebody actually has a larger data set, they usually can be a little bit more helpful, right? So no matter how experienced you are as a CEO or whatever, you've done 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 companies maybe. But any experienced investor will have done an order of magnitude more than that. And so they just have data points that are broader. And then of course they should have a broader set of networks, right? Because there are a lot of things that we can help, whether it be strategic or helping on the exits or financing. We're not going to run the company, but we will have a lot of touch points that should be helpful. And the truth is, even if we're not helpful, we've got 50 other CEOs that you can get to know who can help you anyways. So, I don't want to overstate exactly what it is that any good investor will do, but if they are a good investor, they should be an added resource for you.
Tracy, you bring a tremendous amount of operating experience as well, and you're the founding CEO of at least 1 or 2 companies. Has that been an important part of your investing and sharing insights and mentoring new CEOs?
Yeah, and I think we see a lot because we are early stage of founders and helping them to find their role going forward. We're not, we don't make any hard and fast rules about the roles of founders going forward, but one of the, I think, value add is we're very candid in thinking about talent and bringing in talent. We're usually helping through our network to bring in some early talent. It's a touchy situation. It's also managing through subsequent financings and things like dilution. So those are some of the more kind of ways we try to resonate and help prepare early stage entrepreneurs or first-time entrepreneurs for what that process is and help to demystify it. And so we really see it as an early partnership but recognizing that there are going to be certain things required for some of the later stage folks that we have to plan for.
Yeah, no, those are great points, and I wonder if they sparked any questions or thoughts from our audience. Over here?
I'm curious your thoughts on the future for sustaining engagement, whether it's wearables or any of these other kinds of behavior change solutions, and what have you learned from some of the pitfalls of the companies that failed?
So the question was, what are the thoughts of sustaining engagement and things like wearables, and what some of the pitfalls are? I don't know if you want to take a stab and then others.
So what do you mean by sustaining engagement?
So for example, Fitbit, they make a lot of money buying media, but they can't sustain engagement, so everyone jams packs all the costs up front to make money, but that's not a long-term solution, and then there's plenty of evidence people stop using it after 3 or 6 months. So it's a one-time sale. So, I mean, yes, they're early, but I'm curious if you've learned anything from these companies in your portfolio, or if you've seen that, and where do you see what needs to be improved, and what lessons to learn from?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a data point we look for when we make an investment, is just that engagement level. I mean, clearly with Fitbit, you know, that didn't matter as much, and what they could do is keep upselling into other products or get people to replace them, right? But you know, when we'll see wearables where they're like, hey, after 3 months, you know, there's a 50 to 70% drop off, and that's not interesting for us. And so I would say it's more of a warning sign or red flag for us when we see a company come in with data like that. We look for longer term. It's hard when you're early stage and you only have 6 months of data, right, or a year of data. So the more you can demonstrate, hey, you know, we have a very focused user group, right? If you're focused on a disease area and you've been shown, you know, with diabetes patients, we've seen 60% engagement over 6-month level, and it's a real metric. It's not like, you know, you open the app. It's more, hey, you spent X minutes using the product, you know, something real that you can really demonstrate that engagement. Then I think people are a lot more interested. So
Yeah, I mean, I think your question highlights one of the toughest nuts that there is to crack in this. I mean, you could have the best technology in the world, you can have the best team in the world, but if you're not driving sustainable adoption and changing behavior to that low transaction cost, habit-forming behavior, the drop-off can happen.
You know, one food for thought, this is not probably the exact answer you're looking for, but what we have found is you can offer the carrot or the stick, and the stick is way better than the carrot. And so it's, you know, when you're engaging or forcing I mean, we've learned this, everybody learns this, right? You can give a patient $5 or you can take $5 from them, which is a symmetrical transaction, but they care a lot more about you taking $5 than you giving $5 extra. And so when we think about engagement, unfortunately, you know, the downside of it is actually much more attractive to them.
Sir?
So I have a quick question about getting expertise behind our consumer med tech company. Because a lot of med tech people in the Bay Area, we've got this vast you know, array of people who've done med tech marketing, and they think consumer is easy, I got this, right? But when we're seeding these companies, I always wanted to have an advisor that comes from like a Procter & Gamble or a Clorox, or you know, has brand expertise, and yet those people are super hard to find. So I'm just curious how you guys solve that problem in terms of finding this brand expertise to marry up with your kind of like med tech oriented folks.
So just to repeat the question, it was about finding brand and marketing expertise for consumer med tech focused companies.
Well, okay, so, well, I can tell you what we do at HealthQuest. So a couple things. So you mentioned Procter & Gamble. So one of our advisors is the former president of Procter & Gamble, and so she actually also helps us look at opportunities, but helps us directly with our portfolio companies. Actually, she works with one of them in particular. So, you know, any good investor's job is to be able to help you get those resources. I actually have another partner who's got, actually he's maybe even here, but he's got, you know, 20 years of experience finding people. And so his job is to help, not his job, he does a lot of other things, but one of the things he's great at is helping find people for our companies, right? So at the end of the day, it's not an answer to your problem, but it is the fact that if they're worth anything as an investor, they should be able to find that person for you.
I think that it just, and I welcome other comments, I think the other source for that is looking for strategic investors. So like Johnson & Johnson and our JJDC
Well, this is seed
group.
stage. I'm an angel, so this is seed stage. And I see a lot of deals I like. I think they're great, but they're at a $200 price point.
Mhm.
They want to start in a professional channel, get a halo, and then go
Yeah.
consumer. But I really, the thing that I think they lack the most is the consumer expertise. So if you all know how to solve that problem, help me solve it, and then maybe you'll like the companies we see.
Fair enough.
So I think we're out of time. There may be some additional questions. Just as a reminder, if we could take them outside. I want to thank our panelists, Tracy, Jessica, and Garheng, and thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of the discussion and dialogue.